You don't get a vote on this? My sister's moving in, and it's already decided. She said it flat, like she was reading a note she'd written earlier and was done discussing. We were standing in the living room we paid for together, and somehow I was being informed instead of included. No lead-up, no question, just a settled outcome. We'd lived together for almost 3 years. Same apartment for the last 18 months, rent split down the middle, utilities, groceries, furniture, all shared. Both our names on the lease. We renewed it after a long conversation about boundaries, privacy, and how important it was that this place stayed calm and predictable. The second bedroom was my office. She knew that. I worked hybrid. That room paid half our bills. I asked when this conversation was supposed to have happened. She sighed and said, "I knew you'd overreact, so I handled it." That was the moment the tone shifted. Not defensive, not apologetic, certain. Like she'd already framed me as the problem and moved on. I asked how long her sister would be staying. She said she didn't know. I asked if it was a week, a month, a plan. She shrugged and said, "However long she needs." Her sister wasn't in danger. No eviction notice. No medical emergency. She'd broken up with her boyfriend and didn't want to live alone. According to my girlfriend, that made it urgent and non-negotiable. I said we needed to talk about it before anyone moved in. I mentioned the lease. I mentioned space. I mentioned that adding another adult changes everything. Costs, noise, privacy. She interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "You're not being supportive." That word again, supportive, as if agreement and support were the same thing. I told her I wasn't comfortable with it happening this way. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anything. I just said I needed to be part of the decision. She laughed, not a big laugh, a short one, dismissive. "It's my apartment too," she said. "You don't get to block this." That line stayed with me because it told me exactly how she saw our arrangement. Equal bills, equal lease, unequal authority. That night, she sent a group text with her sister and their mom confirming the move-in date. Mattress size, closet space, parking. I wasn't mentioned once. I stared at the screen and realized the decision had already traveled outward. Family looped in, plans set, me reacting after the fact. The next few days were a quiet escalation. Furniture shifted. The spare room door stayed open. My desk got pushed against the wall. Temporarily, boxes appeared near the hallway closet. Every time I brought it up, she accused me of making things tense. She said family comes first. She said I was choosing control over compassion. I didn't argue back. I watched. By Friday, her sister showed up with 2 suitcases and a laundry basket just to get settled. I wasn't home when it happened. I found out because my office chair was gone and my monitor was unplugged and leaning against the wall. At dinner, the two of them talked logistics like roommates. Grocery schedules, shower times, who would take the couch for the first week. I sat there eating quietly, realizing no one was waiting for my input. This wasn't help, it was replacement. And it wasn't temporary, it was a test. Not of patience, but of how much of my space, my routine, and my voice I was willing to give up without a fight. The next morning, I told her we needed to talk before I left for work. She didn't look up from her phone. She said, "If this is about my sister again, I'm not doing this." I said it was about us making decisions together. I said this wasn't what we agreed to when we renewed the lease. I said adding another person without consent crossed a line. She finally looked at me and said, "She's already here, so what exactly do you want me to do?" That was the answer. Not confusion, not regret, just confirmation that the decision was locked and my discomfort was irrelevant. I told her I needed space and clarity and that I didn't feel respected in my own home anymore. I said this wasn't about hating her sister. It was about being treated like an obstacle instead of a partner. She shook her head and said I was being selfish. She said relationships require compromise. She said if the roles were reversed, she'd never make me choose between her and family. I pointed out that no one was asking her to choose. I was asking to be included before the choice was made. She stood up, grabbed her coffee, and said, "If you can't handle this, that's on you." Something clicked then. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I realized there was no version of this conversation where my input suddenly mattered. She wasn't misunderstanding me. She was overriding me, and she was comfortable doing it. I went into the bedroom, pulled out a suitcase and started packing. Not dramatically, just methodically. Clothes first, laptop, chargers, documents. She followed me and asked what I was doing. I said, "I'm stepping out of this." She laughed again and said I was being impulsive. She said I'd cool off. She said we'd talk later. I kept packing. When I finished, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled up our lease on my phone. Both names, equal responsibility. One clause about unauthorized occupants longer than 14 days without written consent from both tenants. I showed it to her. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my voice. I just told her that if her sister stayed, I would formally notify the landlord that I wasn't consenting to an additional occupant. And if that became an issue, I would remove myself from the lease entirely. Her expression changed then. Not angry, calculating. She asked if I was serious. I said yes. She said I was overreacting again. She said I was trying to scare her. I said no. I was making my position clear before things escalated further. Then I picked up my suitcase and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't send a follow-up text. I went to a short-term rental I'd already bookmarked earlier that week, just in case. I paid for 2 weeks up front. That night, I forwarded the lease clause to her in writing. One message. Clear language. No emotion. I'm not consenting to an additional occupant. If the living arrangement continues, I'll notify the landlord and remove myself from the lease. She didn't reply. The first consequence came faster than I expected. The next afternoon, she called, not to apologize, but to ask if I was really planning to stop paying my half of the utilities while I was cooling off. I told her yes. If I wasn't living there, I wasn't subsidizing a household I didn't agree to. She went quiet. Then she said, "This is really inconvenient." I agreed. Final update. I didn't hear from her for 3 days after that call. No texts, no accusations, just silence. I didn't chase it. I focused on work, kept my routine tight, and stayed where I was. On the 4th day, the landlord emailed both of us. Polite tone, direct question. He asked whether there was an additional occupant in the unit because a neighbor had complained about increased noise and parking issues. He asked for clarification before taking next steps. I replied within an hour. I stated clearly that I had not consented to an additional occupant, that I had temporarily moved out due to the situation, and that I was requesting removal from the lease per the early termination clause if the arrangement continued. No emotions, just facts. She replied 2 hours later. Her message was longer, defensive. She framed it as a misunderstanding. She said her sister was visiting briefly. She didn't give a date. The landlord asked for a written timeline and reminded us of the occupancy terms. 14 days. No exceptions without mutual consent. That night, she finally called. Her tone was different, not confident anymore. Tired, frustrated. She said the landlord was being difficult. She said her sister was stressed. She said this had spiraled too fast. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I told her nothing had spiraled. Things were simply following the structure she ignored. I reminded her that I'd warned her, clearly and calmly. I told her my position hadn't changed. She asked if I was really willing to blow up our relationship over this. I said no. The relationship changed the moment she made a permanent decision without me and expected compliance. This was just the paperwork catching up. 2 days later, the landlord issued a formal notice. Either the additional occupant vacated within 72 hours, or one tenant would need to exit the lease. Fees applied, no negotiation. Her sister moved out that weekend. Not quietly, boxes, complaints, doors closing harder than necessary. I wasn't there for it. I heard about it later from the landlord when he confirmed the unit was back in compliance. My ex didn't ask me to come back. She asked if I would resume paying my half now that things were normal again. I told her no. Normal was gone. I completed the lease removal process the following week. It cost me money, but it bought finality. I transferred utilities out of my name. I changed my address. I closed the shared account we use for household expenses. She sent a long message after that. She said she never meant to disrespect me. She said she felt abandoned. She said she thought I'd been because I always had before. That line told me everything. I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself again. I replied once. I'm not angry. I'm just no longer available for decisions I don't get to be part of. She didn't respond. A month later, I drove past the old place to pick up mail that hadn't been forwarded yet. The lights were off in the second bedroom. A for rent sign was taped to the building door. I didn't stop. I had already moved on. Not emotionally, but structurally. The silence stayed. And for the first time in a long while, so did my space.